It was a crisp autumn evening when I noticed the first crack in my world. My wife, Claire, was out with her friends, or so she said, leaving me at home with a bottle of wine and an old movie. We'd been married for 7 years, long enough to know each other's rhythms and habits. But tonight, something felt different. Her voice on the phone had been too bright, her laughter too forced. I tried to brush it off, but my instincts were uneasy. Claire arrived home just after midnight, giggling like a teenager sneaking back after curfew. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly disheveled, and she smelled of someone else's cologne. My stomach churned, but I forced a smile, pretending nothing was amiss. I had no idea that her small gesture of trying to appear carefree would soon reveal the biggest betrayal of my life. Claire flopped onto the couch, kicking off her heels, and with a carefree grin she said, "You're in a good mood." Her voice was high-pitched, almost giddy. "Yeah, it was a great night," she added, mentioning how fun it was to be with the girls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I noticed her avoiding my gaze and clutching her phone like a lifeline. The next morning, Claire was unusually cheerful. She hummed as she prepared breakfast, her phone buzzing repeatedly, but every time it buzzed, she made no move to check it. Curiosity gnawed at me, and a deep sense of suspicion settled in. I couldn't resist. As she left the room, I grabbed her phone, heart pounding, and unlocked it. What I found would change everything. The text messages were damning. "Last night was amazing, R. I can still feel your touch." Claire had been meeting with someone named M for months. There were photos, too. Her laughing, glass in hand, draped across a man I didn't recognize. My world shattered in an instant. Betrayal hit me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping for air. But I couldn't act on this yet. I needed a plan. I placed the phone back and forced myself to remain calm. Rage would come later. For now, I needed to think clearly. Claire returned to the kitchen, oblivious to my discovery. She kissed me on the cheek and handed me a plate of eggs. Her smile as radiant as ever. How could she pretend everything was fine after what she'd done? Over the next few days, I became a ghost in my own home. I watched Claire closely, listening to her laugh, observing the way she interacted with me, and piecing together the extent of her deceit. The one-night stand she had wasn't just a one-time thing, it was ongoing. She had been meeting him for months, lying to my face. But I said nothing, not yet. I had to wait. The rage simmered beneath my skin, but I controlled it. I focused on gathering evidence. Texts, photos, receipts, anything I could use to expose her. Claire seemed oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, and I kept up the appearance of a devoted husband. I cooked her favorite meals, laughed at her jokes, and even planned a weekend getaway, just the two of us. The weekend trip was my masterpiece. I booked a cabin in the mountains, secluded and picturesque, perfect for getting away from the city. Claire was thrilled, gushing about how much she needed the escape. She didn't suspect that I was laying the groundwork for her downfall. I packed our bags, ensuring everything was perfect, even packing my new hobby equipment. The first night in the cabin was magical, at least on the surface. We drank wine by the fire, reminisced about our early days, and even shared a dance under the stars. But all the while, my mind was elsewhere, focused on the culmination of my plan. Little did Claire know, she was playing right into my hands. The next morning, I told Claire I wanted to take some photos of the scenery. She agreed, and as she snuggled deeper into the blankets to sleep, I grabbed my gear, but not for landscape shots. I set up hidden cameras around the cabin, discreetly capturing angles that would tell the story I needed. I wasn't just documenting the weekend, I was documenting her betrayal. When Claire woke up, I suggested a hike. I told her I'd found a beautiful spot nearby. She was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. We spent hours wandering the trails, laughing and chatting. For a brief moment, I almost forgot the purpose of my plan, almost. But the reality of what she had done to me was never far from my mind. Back at the cabin, Claire's phone buzzed incessantly on the counter. She glanced at it, her expression shifting to one of annoyance. "Work stuff," she muttered dismissively. But I knew better. I had no doubt that it was him. I watched her as she avoided checking the messages, and I knew she was still lying to me. That evening, I prepared her favorite dinner, pouring her another glass of wine. I maintained the appearance of a loving husband, but in reality, I was executing my plan. Every time Claire's wine glass neared empty, I refilled it. Her laughter was carefree, unaware of the storm I was about to unleash. When Claire excused herself to use the bathroom, I saw my opportunity. I took her phone from the counter and sent a single text to him. "Let's end this." Then, I deleted the entire thread, leaving no trace. When Claire returned and checked her phone, her face went pale. The text exchange was gone, but I had planted the seed of doubt in her mind. As we returned home, Claire was back to her usual self. Her laughter echoed through the house, but when she reached for her purse, her face went white. "Where's my wedding ring?" she muttered, panic setting in. I feigned concern, asking her when she last had it. She looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt and desperation. "I must have taken it off somewhere," she whispered. But I knew the truth. The next day, I set my plan into motion. I prepared a file, meticulously organized, that detailed her affair in excruciating detail. Photos, messages, receipts, everything was there. I left it on the kitchen table, knowing she would find it. When she did, the color drained from her face. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The truth," I replied coldly. "Something you've been hiding from me for months." Claire stumbled over her words, trying to explain herself, to justify what she had done. But I held up my hand, silencing her. "I don't want your excuses, Claire. I want you to leave." Her eyes widened in shock. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she begged me to reconsider. "Please, we can work through this. I'll do anything." But I was done. "It's too late," I said. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." I had already spoken to a lawyer. The divorce would be swift, and it would be in my favor. I had all the evidence I needed. As Claire packed her bags, sobbing, I felt no remorse. She had destroyed our marriage, our trust. Now, it was my turn to take back control. The house, the car, even the savings, everything would be mine. She had no idea what hit her. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild my life. Peace returned, bit by bit. Friends distanced themselves from Claire, siding with me once they learned the truth. Claire had lost everything. Mark had ghosted her, and she was left to face the consequences alone. One evening, as I sat on the porch sipping a glass of whiskey, I reflected on the past few months. The pain of betrayal was still there, a dull ache in my chest. But with it came a sense of triumph. I had taken back control. Claire's laughter no longer haunted me. It was replaced by the sound of my own laughter, born of freedom, resilience, and the sweet taste of revenge. Claire left the house in a daze, still sobbing, packing her bags in confusion. She had no idea what had just hit her. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her go. His hands were steady, his mind clear. No guilt, no regret. The woman who had betrayed him for months was now being forced to face the consequences of her own actions. The house felt emptier than ever, but there was a calm in Ethan. His plan was unfolding exactly as he had hoped. Ethan woke up to a silence he had never known. For the first time in years, he was truly alone. No more passive-aggressive comments, no more pretending. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. The first few days felt almost surreal. It wasn't until he received a call from his lawyer, confirming the start of the divorce proceedings, that he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. His life was officially changing, and Claire's actions were the catalyst. It was 3 days later when Claire called. Her voice was shaky, and Ethan could hear the desperation behind her words. "Please, we can fix this. I've made a mistake." But Ethan wasn't interested in apologies. He had nothing left to say to her. The call ended quickly, but not before Claire asked, "Will you ever forgive me?" Ethan stood silent, a bittersweet smile creeping up. "No," he replied, "and you're going to have to live with that." The line went dead, and Ethan felt a small spark of triumph. Word of Ethan's divorce quickly spread among their circle of friends. Surprisingly, most of them sided with Ethan. Claire's affair, once hidden in the shadows, was now out in the open. Friends that once admired her distanced themselves, while others came forward, offering their sympathy and support. Ethan wasn't ready for their kindness, but it felt good to know that Claire wasn't the only one with power in this situation. Meanwhile, Claire's life was unraveling. Mark had ghosted her, unwilling to deal with the consequences of his actions. She had nobody left. The texts from Mark stopped coming. The friends she had thought would take her side disappeared one by one. Claire found herself in a world she couldn't control, isolated and vulnerable. She began to reflect on her choices, but it was too late for regret. As weeks passed, Ethan focused on rebuilding his life. He threw himself into his work, went on small trips, and spent time with the friends who had stood by him. The support he had gathered in the wake of the betrayal made him stronger. He wasn't the man he was before. He had found a new sense of purpose. He had rediscovered himself. And with every passing day, he realized just how much better life could be without Claire. Claire had sunk into a deep depression. Her once carefree demeanor had been replaced with sleepless nights and constant worry. Her calls to Ethan became more frantic, more pleading. "I've made a huge mistake. I'm sorry," she would text, but Ethan never responded. He had no more words for her. Claire's internal turmoil had become unbearable. She no longer recognized herself. She had destroyed everything, and now she was paying the price. The divorce papers arrived, and Ethan sat at his kitchen table, reviewing them with calm detachment. The house, the savings, the car. Everything he had worked for was now his. Claire had been left with nothing but the consequences of her actions. The settlement was swift, and with it, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This was the end of a chapter, but it wasn't the end of his story. Then came a phone call. It was from Claire's mother, who pleaded with Ethan to reconsider, claiming that Claire was a wreck and couldn't handle the breakup. "She's not the same person anymore," her mother said. Ethan listened, but there was no sympathy in his voice. "That's the price she has to pay," he said before hanging up. He was done. Claire had made her choices, and now she had to face them. One evening, Claire showed up at Ethan's doorstep. She was crying, her face pale, eyes red. She begged him to let her explain, to give her one more chance. But Ethan saw her for what she was, someone who only wanted to fix her own mistakes, without considering the damage she had done. "I've heard enough," he said coldly. "You don't get to undo what you've done." With that, he closed the door, leaving Claire standing outside, a broken woman. Ethan found himself torn. He had moved on, but the emotional toll of betrayal still lingered in the quiet moments of the night. His thoughts sometimes drifted back to the woman he once loved, but he refused to allow the memories to control him. The pain, the disappointment, he used it to fuel his growth. He would not be the man who allowed betrayal to define his future. Claire, on the other hand, spiraled further. She tried to reach out to mutual friends, but they shut her down. Her social circle dwindled, and soon, she was left alone. She found herself staring at the life she had once shared with Ethan, wishing she could go back and undo everything. But life didn't work that way. The damage was done, and she couldn't erase the past. One night, Ethan found himself on his porch, looking at the stars. He realized that he had come so far. He wasn't the same person who had been devastated by Claire's betrayal. He had healed, rebuilt his life, and learned to value himself again. It was time to fully let go of Claire in the past. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He knew that true peace would come when he stopped looking back. Ethan began to explore new hobbies, meet new people, and slowly started to open himself up to the possibility of new relationships. The idea of love no longer scared him. He had been hurt, yes, but he had also learned the importance of trust, communication, and most importantly, self-love. His heart was healing, piece by piece. Claire reached out to Ethan once again, this time through a letter. She poured out her heart, expressing her regret and asking for forgiveness. "I know I ruined everything, but I can't live with the guilt," she wrote. Ethan read the letter, but instead of feeling sympathy, he felt a quiet sense of relief. Claire's apology didn't matter anymore. He had already moved on. Ethan called Claire one last time. He told her that he had received the letter and thanked her for the apology, but he also made it clear that there was nothing left between them. "I've moved on," he said firmly. "I'm better off without you." The conversation ended amicably, but there was no more room for Claire in his life. It was time to move forward. Months passed, and Ethan's life continued to improve. He found joy in simple things, like morning walks, deep conversations with new friends, and discovering new passions. He realized that he was not just surviving, he was thriving. The emotional scars from his marriage to Claire were healing, and he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Claire, on the other hand, had to confront the reality of her choices. She lost her job due to the affair's exposure and found herself starting over. But unlike Ethan, she struggled to rebuild. The man she had chosen over her husband was nowhere to be found, and the friends she had once relied on had turned their backs on her. Claire finally realized that her actions had destroyed everything she held dear. One day, Ethan met someone new. Her name was Emma, and she was kind, thoughtful, and understanding. They bonded over shared interests and mutual respect. Ethan was cautious at first, but as they spent more time together, he realized that he was ready to love again. This relationship, though new, was built on the foundation of trust, something he had learned to value more than ever before. As Ethan and Emma's relationship grew, Ethan found himself in a place of peace. He was no longer haunted by the betrayal of his past. He had forgiven himself and had learned to move forward. Claire's memory, though painful, was now just a distant echo in his life. He had a new future, one he was excited to embrace. Ethan's life had transformed completely. He had gone from a man destroyed by betrayal to someone who had found strength in the most unlikely place, within himself. The final lesson he had learned was that healing comes from within. No one could give him peace except for himself. Claire, still struggling with her actions, hit rock bottom. She tried to reach out to Ethan one final time, but he refused. She had no one left. Her loneliness consumed her, and the realization that her actions had cost her everything was a bitter pill to swallow. Ethan sat alone one night, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The pain of the past had finally been replaced with a sense of gratitude for the lessons learned. He was no longer a victim of Claire's betrayal. He was a man who had found his strength. Months later, Claire reached out once again, this time apologizing without asking for anything in return. "I destroyed everything, and I can't undo it," she said. Ethan simply thanked her for the apology and wished her the best. He had moved on, and that chapter was closed forever. Ethan's future was no longer defined by Claire or her betrayal. He had built a new life, one that was filled with love, peace, and purpose. He looked forward to what the future held, knowing that he had the strength to handle whatever came next. Ethan said goodbye to the past. The memories of Claire no longer held any power over him. He was free, truly free, and ready for the next chapter of his life. As Ethan embraced his new life, he realized that the freedom he had longed for wasn't just about getting away from Claire, it was about reclaiming his happiness. He was no longer defined by betrayal. He was defined by his resilience. The sun rose on a new day, and Ethan stepped into his future with confidence. The pain of the past had shaped him, but it no longer controlled him. He was free to live the life he had always dreamed of. With a new relationship, new purpose, and a heart finally at peace, Ethan embraced his future with open arms.